I'm Nala Huda, and you're tuning in to another edition of Dialog ASEAN 25. The world's attention is, of course, now turned towards the intensifying conflict between Iran and Israel, and now with the US in the picture. So, on this episode of Dialog ASEAN 25, we want to take a look at how this conflict, this instability in the Middle East, might potentially impact Southeast Asia, how ASEAN might want to respond to this. And so, on this episode of Dialog ASEAN 25, we want to take a closer look at not just the conflict, but also at the ASEAN Political Security Community Strategic Plan 2025 and how it might help the region in navigating this another geopolitical quagmire and other geopolitical issues as well. So to help us unpack some of these current developments and also to take a closer look at the ASEAN Political Security Community Strategic Plan, we have joining us Dr. Julia Rognifart, Senior Lecturer at the School of Law and Governance at Taylor's University, Dr. Rustum Vansu, Senior Lecturer at the Institute of Peace Studies at Prince of Songkla University, and Dr. Farid Kimbeng, Professor of ASEAN Studies Institution, International Islamic University of Malaysia. Thank you so much to our panelists joining us today.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you.
So, Dr. Julia, I think I want to start with you. Just, I guess, some of your general thoughts on recent developments with Iran, Israel, and now the US getting involved. Did you see this coming, or did this come as a surprise to you?
I think that's a conversation that we could have alone for a couple of hours about everything that happened within this so-called 12-day war, as Donald Trump suggested to call it. There was indeed, there were tensions between Iran and Israel, hostility, rather to say not tensions, animosity, as well as between Iran and the United States. However, Iran, prior to the Israeli attacks, has been involved in another round of negotiations with the United States under Donald Trump, where the result was supposed to be something as a reiteration of the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, or the so-called Iran deal that was agreed upon in 2015, and from which President Trump, during his first term, exited in 2018. In 2019, exactly 1 year after, in May, Iran also started to limit its obligations on this so-called Iran deal on JCPOA. In particular, enriching uranium to higher percentage, introducing some of the new, more advanced centrifuges, and so on. For Israel, the case of animosity with Iran has been taking place since the Iran Revolution of 1979, even though they still preserved some of its cooperation for the years into the Iran-Iraq War after the revolution. However, because one of the major premises of the newly established Islamic Republic was its anti-Israelism, anti-Israeli stance, this animosity started to build up. And within the Israeli society, right now we can see that society might be split on the issue of the war on Gaza, but when it comes to Iran, and Israel doing everything what is necessary to provide for the security of Israel and its society, then the society is pretty much united. And this is because for a long time, this security narrative, securitization narrative was built around Iran as a major threat, because the rhetoric is there. Sometimes there are chants such as death to Israel, death to America, which we hear in Iran. And there is also this controversial issue of Iran's nuclear threat, the possibility of Iran creating nuclear weapons, which it currently does not have. It was confirmed by the International Atomic Energy Agency, IAEA, and its chief Rafael Grossi. However, in Israel and Trump administration echoed it. The sentiment is that no, Iran has been lying all this time, and it has been acting in cahoots with the IAEA, with the IAEA. And it has been trying to build a bomb, in particular to drop it on Israel. So we could have seen it coming. The Israel prepared this operation for years, probably. They were ready. They tried different scenarios, but so were Iranians. looking at this potential threat, they also had a number of rehearsals, including on the, for example, blockade of Hormuz Strait, something that we'll probably discuss later today. So this could have been coming. However, again, returning back to negotiations between Iran and the United States, it looked like a normal diplomatic process within which they were supposed to reach some solution, especially before this Iran nuclear deal at JCPOA would expire in October this year. And it would continue with the Islamic Republic in Iran in place, with Israel having its reservations. However, everybody staying where they are and treating each other peacefully, except for we put the what's going on in Gaza and the West Bank as a separate matter. So it was quite a surprise that one, Israel decided to attack Iran directly. And two, that the United States, with President Trump saying otherwise, deciding to get engaged into this, in particular to bomb the nuclear facilities, the three nuclear facilities in Natanz, Fordo, and Esfahan. We can discuss the reasons why Trump has done this, but I guess it's beyond the scope of our today's conversation. So it was quite shocking. And unfortunately, I don't think we can consider that this truce, this ceasefire is going to be stable for the even days or weeks to come, due to a number of reasons. One, the goals of those operations by the United States and Israel are quite unclear what they were trying to achieve. Two, if the goal was, for example, to destroy the Iran's nuclear program, seems even that has not succeeded, because one, it would require the ground operation for that, which I don't think either of them is ready to engage in. And two, because Iran actually evacuated whatever equipment and stockpile of enriched uranium it had in those facilities. So the Iranian nuclear program remains more or less intact, minus these facilities that could have been destroyed, but they could be rebuilt. So there are many moving parts. It's quite hard to understand what were the purposes of these operations. But I think the forecast would be to cautiously watch if this is going to escalate, and not even within a year, where the United States, for example, decides that it needs to bomb Iran's nuclear program again in order to put another dent on it. And any other idea comes to the minds of Israeli or American leadership on the possibility of regime change or something like that. So the situation remains pretty unstable, and I don't think we're out of the woods yet.
Dr. Rustam, what are your thoughts? Did you see it escalating at this rate?
Yes, first of all, we need to mention that Israel was the aggressor first, and Iran was the one attacked. Yeah. So when we consider the outcome of the war, the question: did Israel achieve its objectives, and was Iran able to resist Israel? So Israel had three objectives in this war. The first one is eliminate Iran's ability to develop nuclear weapons. The second one is eliminate Iran missile capabilities. And the third one is achieve regime change in Iran. However, in the end, Israel, in my opinion, was unable to achieve any of these three objectives, while Iran maintained its vast missile arsenal with the capacity to strike Israel. But in my sense and in my opinion, all of these are predictable before. Things of in that way that in international game there is no real boss telling everyone what to do. So every country main goal is just to survive. Both Iran and Israel are scared to each other. So they constantly trying to get more powerful than the others. From the view of like often realism, Iran pushed to get nuclear weapons makes sense in the world with no global rule, no global government. every country want to be strong and safe. So for Iran, nuclear weapons are the ultimate way to protect itself and gain more power in the region. Having nukes would make Iran harder to attack and give it more influence, especially over rival like Israel. But Israel strongly objects because a nuclear Iran would threaten its security and power. Israel already has nuclear weapons and doesn't want to lose its edge. That's why Israel has taken military action to stop Iran nuclear program. The US support Israel because it doesn't want Iran to change the balance of power in the Middle East region. So yes, this kind of escalation was expected. Uh, and in For the power leads to the fear, and fear leads to conflict, especially when nuclear weapons are involved.
Yeah. Dr. Julia, you mentioned a little bit about what some of the factors that could have um, explained why Trump did so. Before we just go on to some of the impact or potential impact on Southeast Asia, I just want to quickly touch on some of, I guess, a little bit of the US domestic and foreign policy. Trump, I guess we can all see, was very clearly very frustrated with how Israel acted after the ceasefire was announced. I think even more so frustrated with Israel rather than Iran. Funnily enough, do you think that we could see this conflict potentially leading to a fallout or a major impact to the US and Israel's relations?
I don't think so. I think Trump is a showman, and this was a kind of a show that he put up. He thought that it's going to be a little victorious war. He could look good to not just to his own public, which is contentious, US engagement at the foreign wars, but to the international public, yes, that fading away hegemon, which still can move figures on the board and achieve what it needs to. So it was meant to be this one-off kind of operation. And this is why we saw post this when Iran actually needed to respond to the Israeli strikes, but to the US strikes as well. The target for this chosen was also symbolic, the US base Al Udeid in Qatar. Which was, I'm sure, agreed by all the parties between Qatar and the United States and between Qatar and Iran, that it is going to be the one to be sacrificed. That's why it was emptied also in advance, so nobody could get hurt. So we could call it a day and exit it victoriously for Trump to put up this show that he could be a great mediator and fulfill at least one of his election promises, trying to eliminate threats, but at the same time not get US entangled into foreign wars. But then it might be as well a show, his frustration with Benjamin Netanyahu, how that acted. And that could be said that Netanyahu responded to the Iranian strikes, which I think there was some confusion about the time of the ceasefire. So Iranians struck and Israel had to respond. I do not see it leading to any rift in the US-Israeli relations. And in fact, any administration so far, Democratic, Republican, Trump, Obama, or whoever, was unconditionally supporting Israel. And I don't see that changing if it hasn't changed after what was happening in Gaza. And then if it hasn't changed with Israel violating the sovereignty of Iran, which goes against the international norms. So no, I don't foresee any rift between the two.
Yeah. Now, we want to move to how this might potentially impact Southeast Asia. Dr. Farr, maybe you can perhaps share some of your thoughts. If this conflict were to go on for much longer, were to stretch out, how do you see this potentially causing some effect or some impact on Southeast Asia?
I'm assuming that you are referring to the conflict in the Middle East right now.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, first of all, I come off as an optimist when you are referring to the impact of the Middle East on Southeast Asia. Now, obviously, when the prices of oil were to go up, then Malaysia would gain because Petronas gains as and when the price of oil is more than $70 per barrel. That's one. Secondly, Southeast Asia no doubt will be affected by the possibility of imported inflation because we as a region has a lot of goods that are imported from abroad. And if there's anything that is happening in Middle East, Straits of Hormuz, Red Sea, then the supply chain will be affected. That be that as it may, Southeast Asia would still gain, principally because the region has crafted a vision, whether it's in the Kuala Lumpur statement in ASEAN, GCC, and China Economic Summit. We have all agreed that we want to have things such as ASEAN power grid that originates from Yunnan, southwest of China, all the way to Vietnam, Cambodia, Laos, Thailand, Malaysia, even with a submarine cable to Sarawak, and potentially to not excluding Indonesia or Singapore too. So in that sense, we have an economic vision that is quite encouraging. So as and when we do not get involved in any open warfare, unlike what is happening now in the Middle East, we will be on the good stead.
Dr. Farr, it's great that you can be rather optimistic in time of war, but if you had to be, or if you had to put on the hat of a devil's advocate, what would you see potentially some of the negative effects of this conflict on Southeast Asia, if any?
That's an excellent question. To the degree I'm allowed to do that, then I would say that monkey sees, monkey do. So assuming that Tehran is heavily bombed and the ceasefire breaks, then very obviously they will keep heading towards the nuclear direction, the nuclear weaponization. Now, as you may know, the region has a zone of peace, freedom, and neutrality. That's one. The region also subscribed to a nuclear taboo based on Southeast Asia nuclear weapons free zone, SHONFES, which is what we people in ASEAN Secretariat normally refer to it. If the region in Middle East goes nuke by virtue of what Iran insists on doing, and more countries pull out and maneuver themselves away from the Non-Proliferation Treaty, of which Iran is still a member, but Israel is not, then there is a strong likelihood that Southeast Asian countries, which is a distribution of different authoritarian and also democratic regime, might still want to have nuclear weapons as a safe and strong backup option, security option.
Dr. Rustam, what are your thoughts on either rather positive or negative fallout, some of the impacts of this conflict on Southeast Asia? Any specific countries perhaps that might benefit from this? As Dr. Farr mentioned, oil-producing countries might see this as a bit of an opportunity, but what are your thoughts?
Yeah, I think Iran and its ally, like Houthi in Yemen, they located in very good position on geographical stance. Like Iran can control Hormuz Strait, and while Houthi can control Bab al-Mandab on the route to Red Sea. So this is their bargaining chip for Iran and for Houthi, and we fortunately, that this war between Iran and Israel was de-escalate and then reach to the ceasefire. Otherwise, we may see Iran will block the route to the Strait of Hormuz and will impact a lot on on Southeast Asia. But if the fight in the Middle East, if the fight between Iran and Israel keep going for a long time, I think Southeast Asia will feel it a lot. We suffer a lot. We uh, so think about the products not getting here easily because of supply chains messed up, or big change in how things are bought and sold around the world. Uh, there could even be less money coming into our region as global investors get scared and pull back. This instability could really slow down our economic growth and make everything cost more for everyday people, which is the last thing we need. It's not just about the direct conflict, but about the long-term uncertainty it creates that impact everyone.
Now we want to look at some of the response or perhaps lack thereof from ASEAN member states. I guess one response that we can see is from Malaysia when just today or yesterday, Prime Minister Anwar Ibrahim says that despite its consistent stance against violence as a solution, Malaysia does acknowledge Iran's right to defend itself against attacks to its sovereignty. And I believe Malaysia, at the time of this recording, has been the only country to put out a statement regarding or relating to this conflict. I don't think there's been any statement yet coming from other countries, or at least a strong one. And of course, there hasn't been any statement at all from the ASEAN bloc itself. Dr. Farr, do you think that this is an area where ASEAN should step up and make a stance?
When it comes to releasing a statement, the ASEAN Regional Organization has in fact released multiple statements before. For instance, ASEAN is actually all for a two-state solutions on Palestine. You cannot find it on the website, but as someone who worked in the organization before, I've seen the statement many years ago. Now, on this specific conflict in Iran and Israel, with the subsequent involvement of the United States and then withdrawal of the United States as an active participant right now, ASEAN actually has a caucus in the United Nations. So the 10 member states of ASEAN has formed into a caucus, a talking club within the institutions of United Nations, to the degree that you see United Nations opposing this war, then you can almost be certain that ASEAN is involved in the process of contributing to the drafting of that statement. So no direct statement, for reasons that I can only hazard a guess, which is the tendency of trying not to offend all parties and the United States. The complexity of the conflict is one where we want to have a good relationship with Iran. We want to have a good relationship with the United States. There are 7 countries around the regions that have normal relationship with Israel. We also want to have very, very good relationship with the Gulf Cooperation Council. Yet we do know for a fact that the Gulf Cooperation Council, for instance, putatively side with Iran, but have statements that also enjoin Iran not to attack any one of their member states, especially the Al Udeid US Air Base in Qatar. So when you say less, you are actually strengthening your diplomatic position even more.
Dr. Julia, do you agree with this, that the less you say, the stronger you are? And might I add as well, perhaps one of the reasons why this statement or this ASEAN stance on or support for a two-state solution hasn't made very, very public is perhaps there is some fragmentation, there is some division to that statement, to that kind of stance. But going back to my question, Dr. Julia, do you agree with that?
Not sure silence is golden in this particular case, but it's rather comes out of the regulations and practices that and principles on which ASEAN is built. It's true, you're right. There was no, or at least correct me if I'm wrong, there was no joint statement by ASEAN on particularly on the matter of Israel violating Iran's sovereignty. And the response overall has been muted. Yes, there was condemnation of violence and aggression, death of civilians, or concern expressed by individual states, but ASEAN states, ASEAN as a whole grouping did not condemn Israel. And in this case, I think if Malaysia starts talking on behalf of the whole bloc, other ASEAN members won't be happy. As my colleague just pointed out, quite a few members of ASEAN have good ties with Israel, probably too good. At least, actually, 7 members of ASEAN we can count. They have ties with Israel, some very tight, like Thailand, for example, including military technical cooperation, or Singapore, or the Philippines, and others as well. So I don't think it's the situation where they can stand as a bloc. And also, look, the Middle Eastern states, the Persian Gulf states, Iran's neighbors, some of them apparently even allowed the use of their airspace for this operation by Israel. So it's not much for us to do in ASEAN against that. I think the ASEAN states, they can push for peace, offer moral support, diplomatic support, but more than that, especially when many of us in ASEAN here are conducting their individual bilateral talks with the US over tariffs, it's not the moment to speak strongly on this matter, and that's why they are not. So it rather comes out of inability to do so, or out of, let's put it better, constraint to do so, than laying grounds for future diplomacy, I think.
If we were to take into account concepts or principles like ASEAN centrality, and if we want to look as well very specifically at the ASEAN Political Security Community, or the APSC strategic plan or blueprint for 2025, it was just adopted recently in the last summit and the recent one. Some of the goals or the points stated, it acts as a roadmap for ASEAN to drive its regional architecture, to project its position on regional and global issues, and that the community should project the ASEAN position on regional issues. Another strategic goal 5 states that the bloc is a contributor to the maintenance of international peace and security, and many more I can quote. Dr. Rustam, do you think this is an area where ASEAN should assert itself, given that they strongly uphold some of these principles, the principle of ASEAN centrality and neutrality and whatnot? Is this where they should make their stance clear?
I think we should have this kind of intention, but in my opinion, there are two kind of limitation is there. The first thing is that ASEAN is known for its consensus model, where everyone has to agree. So this is a kind of one obstacle. And another thing is that the conflict beyond this ASEAN region, the conflict beyond this region is very difficult that ASEAN will can involve. The conflict in the Middle East and the war in Russia, Ukraine, is far beyond ASEAN capacity to effectively mediate and bring to the end. But that is good intention. That is good intention that we may have this blueprint of APSC. But it's quite a lot. It's quite a lot of some limitation that we may not fulfill our role on this thing. Yes.
Dr. Four, of course, we want your valuable insight on the ASEAN political security community. You had some direct experience with this. Given that this political security community has so much emphasis on, the principles of centrality, on asserting a rules-based international order, do you think that ASEAN has done enough, has utilized enough of this, diplomacy and dialogue in pushing for de-escalation in conflicts in the past, perhaps in wars like Ukraine and Russia, in the conflict in Gaza, and now with this newly developing conflict? Do you think that this is, where they can flex some of their principles of dialogue and diplomacy?
At the risk of over-intellectualizing the issue, I add that caveat because ASEAN is a nebulous subject. It's not easy to understand. But having said so, allow me to just chime in and offer whatever I can to clarify the situation or the questions that you just posed. Now, ASEAN can in fact do more because it has become a very good example of how formal and informal diplomacy, when merged or combined, can actually produce a region that is a safe corner in a very turbulent world. What I meant by that is that from 1979 onwards, ASEAN has actually become the sub-region that has never had any severe interstate conflict until this very moment, even with the inclusion of the recent border skirmish between Cambodia and Thailand. It's actually over a very, very small area. Otherwise, from 1979 onwards, ASEAN, by extension, the whole of East Asia, have not had a very significant or continuous interstate conflict that is armed and dangerous. Now, to the degree that we know how to promote and position ourselves as a regional organization that is good at diplomacy, once again, formal or diplomal, then we are actually right up in the league when it comes to confidence building, preventive diplomacy. We haven't really achieved peacekeeping yet, even though that is stated in ASEAN Regional Forum. The meeting will be had on July 10 and 11 next month, comprising of all the foreign and occasionally security and defense minister of 27 member states. Finally, we should also, according to the statement of 1994 of ASEAN Regional Forum, we should have what is known as joint maritime cooperations. So you do have countries such as New Zealand and Australia, as and when they are in what is known as ARF, ASEAN Regional Forum, who begin to question the realistic nature of ASEAN in contributing to the world peace, because most countries are still stuck in the process of confidence building dialogue. And in the case of Malaysia, we refer to it as trust building mechanism. Because an actual and proper confidence building mechanism would come in two pillars. One is information regime, where you divulge and review your military doctrine openly to your neighbors and member states. Two, you must have a verification regime. As Ronald Reagan once said, trust but verify. We don't have the second pillar, yet we are doing quite well in terms of safeguarding our defense, sovereignty, and whatnot, with one or two exceptions as and when it applies to, say, the conflict in Cambodia and Thailand, which has not been properly resolved over the UNESCO heritage site. We don't have a perfect record on Myanmar. Again, situations is very fluid because as of the ASEAN summit in Kuala Lumpur last month or the month prior, my sources have explained to me that we have actually convinced Senior General Min Aung Hlaing to meet with the group chair, which is Prime Minister Anwar Ibrahim, Senior General Min Aung is also willing to contemplate and explore a stronger and longer ceasefire on the ground in order to permit the humanitarian aid and groups, whether it's MAHA in Malaysia or perhaps Shuchi Foundation that has strong branches all over the region, they are then able to go in and serve the Myanmar people and residents affected by either the earthquake or the civil war.
Mm. Now, of course, this moves us a little bit away from the topic, but what you shared with us is rather quite interesting. When you say that General Min Aung Hlaing is interested in meeting with the leadership here to discuss a little bit more about making more efforts towards allowing humanitarian aid, do you see this as being purely symbolic, or do you genuinely believe that there's real change and progress that could be made here?
I like to defer to what Dr. Julia said earlier, that silence may not be golden. I agree, silence may not be golden at all. But what ASEAN does is a very unique and intricate form of diplomacy where they may be occasionally very quiet on the forefront in international relations, but they are actually actively doing all kinds of things behind the scene to try to improve the likelihood of peace. So when it comes to Myanmar, where you have a very obstinate and stubborn leader willing to engage with various stakeholders, including allowing Prime Minister Anwar Ibrahim to have a dialogue with the National Unity Government of Myanmar, whose principal leader is Aung San Suu Kyi, then you can interpret that as some kind of permissiveness, diplomatic permissiveness to enable and to strengthen the hand of the group chair to enhance the importance of the 5-point consensus, of which the first point is all about ceasefire and nothing more. So when you have that, that is process leading to a potential progress, rather than the whole of Myanmar crumbling into potential 8 different pieces. I'm referring to ethnic nationalist organizations that can form their own states and then foster all kinds of cyber crimes and syndicate. And according to UN estimate, those activities have raked in more than 67.7 billion US dollars a year. That's a very significant and substantial figure because the GDP of Singapore is only half a trillion. Malaysia is $380 billion. So they're catching up those cyber crimes and syndicates.
Yeah, very interesting points there, but we do have to save that for another day because we do want to go back to what we were discussing on the conflict between Iran and Israel. I do want to go back to what Dr. Julia mentioned a little bit about how relations with the Israeli government is still very much embedded, very deep in the region, in Southeast Asia itself, amongst some other governments. But if we were to draw some comparison between what's happening here and what's happening in the West, we're seeing in the US and in some European countries, there is this sort of growing disconnect between what the leadership thinks or shows in their relations with the Israeli government and what the mainstream thought, the mainstream thinking, what the people are saying about, how perhaps societies should reconsider their relationships with Israel at large. And if we were to compare that with Southeast Asia, I guess that's not gaining as much traction, not gaining as much momentum in other Southeast Asian countries, apart from Malaysia and Indonesia, of course, with a lot of the governments still forging very close relations with Israel. How do you see this sort of playing out if this conflict were to go on? Will this sort of frustration, this discontent grow in Southeast Asian societies as much as we're seeing it developing and escalating very rapidly in the West?
So far, we haven't been seeing this rise of discontent in the Southeast Asian societies, despite the governments, the G2G relations between the Southeast Asian countries and Israel. And I think that comes from the differences, the foundational differences that we have with the Western societies of the day. It's quite a different cultural background and maybe to some point a luxury to talk about these issues that are outside of the countries but do not have a direct impact except for maybe military spending on the countries within Europe or the United States. So there is this demand for justice of sorts in the Western societies that we are observing, something that maybe we can see that in the pockets among activists, among active people actively watching and thinking about what's happening in the Middle East. It also, of course, goes in line with this general sentiment in the so-called Global South, where the public in general might be having this background discontent with how things are managed globally, with how some hegemons interfere into the external, for them, regions, into their affairs, and dare to dictate what they should do. But on the people's level of the general public, of the masses, I don't think that request to their governments is so strong, especially if we talk about non-Muslim majority nations within ASEAN. So we don't talk about Malaysia and Indonesia, where this sentiment is traditionally stronger and also used in the political rhetoric by the sitting governments, because we have a lot of issues to tend to, and some of them were highlighted in this ASEAN 2045 vision, including the political security community, but also economic community, sociocultural community. And we have to deal with a plethora of those issues like aging, food security, energy security, of course, security in South China Sea. And these challenges already consume vast resources and attention. So the public attention. So ASEAN tends to be more inward-centric in this sense, if we look at it at the public level. And even if the conflict continues, I think what is to encourage people to rise up with some sort of demand to their governments is a blockade of the Hormuz Strait. So people, it will strike, it will hit their pocket. People will feel the economic impact. But otherwise, it will remain probably on the level of this solidarity, the general solidarity with the Global South, where Iran stands for its sovereignty. And I think the idea that some other countries, at least in the region, could be next after this, either of victims of this escalation or maybe even victims of expansionist demands on the part of other regional and extra-regional actors. So apart from this general sentiment and a little bit of activism amongst the people who really watch what's going on in the Middle East currently, it's going to be to remain the same how we are seeing it now.
Dr. Rustom, your thoughts on this, just to quickly touch on the issue of public sentiment. I mean, we're drawing comparisons between, of course, different public sentiment in Muslim majority nations like Malaysia and Indonesia, of course, have long had this sort of discontent and frustration with the global order at large, but also specifically at how Israel has been responding to these crises and committing genocide, basically. If this conflict were to play out for much longer, do you think that it might have any effect on public sentiment among Thai people with how the Israeli government is responding and reacting to these incidents?
Yes, I think in ASEAN, it might be the mixed bag of responses, even in Thailand society, between Muslim, between the other Thais in this society. So it might be indifferent to Muslim-dominated country like in Malaysia or in Indonesia. Like for Malaysia, Indonesia, we can observe that a much stronger reaction, including on Israeli policy or war on Palestine or even for Iran. And the population often feel a deep connection to issue in Middle East, especially those involving Muslim community and their struggles. So this strong public sentiment could translate into more vocal official statement from their government and perhaps strong condemnation call for international intervention or appeal for humanitarian aid. It might also lead to push within ASEAN for a more robust and assertive collective stance from the bloc on the conflict, and their domestic sentiment often significantly influence their foreign policy on such matter. But there's some development like in Thailand. I can say that since the October War between Israel and Palestine, so the public sentiment among Thai, I think I observed that there's something changed. People have more understanding about the dispute cause of conflict, and also by the impact of the war in the Middle East between Israel Palestine, even Russia or Ukraine. So many tourists, it means Israeli tourists, they came to Thailand, and by their number is is more and more every day. So there's some tension between those Israeli tourist community with Thais. So now people even Thai the general Thai people now they more more feel caution about the relation with Israel, and they fear that this kind of conflict in the Middle East will at least push those Israeli tourists come more in the bigger number to Thailand, and it may create some security problem to Thailand. Yes.
Now, just looking at everything that's happening with the conflict in the Middle East, great power rivalry intensifying, and also not to forget some issues in our own backyard, maritime tensions. Dr. Far, do you think ASEAN is genuinely ready to uphold a lot of these principles that are stated in their many, many declarations, in their strategic plan, be it the political security community or many other sort of papers and documents? Do you think that the bloc is actually ready to uphold some of these principles, or do you think that there's this risk of them just being a bystander and this being purely rhetoric and symbolic?
The implementation will always have a gap because most of the languages are lofty and aspirational. And that has always been the case with all regional organizations, whereas it is ASEAN, European Union, or even all the way to universal organizations such as the United Nations. So that is a reality that cannot be changed or altered. That having been said, as I mentioned earlier, ASEAN has a rather decent historical record of avoiding war. And to the degree that you can avoid interstate war, then the foundation that Dr. Julia mentioned about earlier provides a very strong base for all kinds of economic development or perhaps future visualization of what the region wants to be. Because the global economy, with or without ASEAN, is definitely hurtling towards the future where it is driven by artificial intelligence, automation, the proliferation of algorithm, apps-driven economy, augmented reality, and analysis of big data, all of which manifest in the form of the necessity of data processing centers, both for ourselves and for the world, if we do want to become the hub. And as a result of which, there will always be a high degree of realism involved in our economic policy making. So when we are positioning ourselves as that hub of data processing centers, for instance, you have the likes of Singapore working very closely with Malaysia to develop the Johor economic corridor, which is gaining traction again. Now, coming back to the issue of whether we can actually close the chasm between rhetoric and reality, we can and we must, which is why there are scholars who have now pivoted to saying, including myself, what we have as ASEAN way must now be translated into ASEAN will, because given the nature of the very turbulent world right now, where the United States is trying to unhinge and divorce itself from the economic order, we have no one else but to depend on our initiatives and our political determination to strengthen region.
Yeah, we just have about a minute or two left, but Dr. Julia, I do want to get your final thoughts on this. As Dr. Farr says, be it ASEAN, the EU, or the GCC, there's this implementation gap, right? But when we're seeing conflicts like this prolonging, we're seeing lives lost, we're seeing civilizations being brought to ruins, international norms broken and thrown out the window, really. Does this suggest just a breakdown in multilateral frameworks at large? And is it time that we reconsider the global order? Or is that too big of a question, maybe?
It's too big of a question for 1 minute, but to answer it shortly, yes, we definitely seen this breakdown of the international order, something that we've been talking about for quite a long time already. It's just the contours of the new one have not emerged yet, but with the political rhetoric, the actions, the breach of sovereignty of sovereign states that has occurred just now, I think it's quite clear that the international norms are being trampled, and the global order that we established post-World War II is breaking down, and we need some kind of a different global consensus which have not emerged yet, and this brings us to the risks of this current escalation into Third World War and the post-settlements, but we'll of course hope it won't reach there.
Yeah, let's hope so. And we'll obviously keep a close eye on these developments. And thank you so much to our panelists for helping us make sense of what's happening. Dr. Far Kim Beng, Dr. Julia Rognifat, and Dr. Rustom Vansu, sharing very critical, valuable insights on what's happening today with Iran and Israel, and how ASEAN has been responding, or lack thereof, to some of these developments. Thank you once again to our panelists. Thank you for tuning in to Dialog ASEAN 25. We'll catch you another time.